people, to tell you the truth, and I know we're getting off topic here, but people don't care how long it lasted. They care that it happened.
Right.
And I care that it happened. The day we start incarcerating members of the clergy, be they Jewish, Muslim, or Christian, okay, or any other faith for that matter, we've got a big problem. And I don't care if it happens once, because a right lost by one of us is a right lost by all of us.
Exactly.
I kind of like that. I should write that down somewhere.
I think I've heard that said in different ways.
Well, basically, I didn't think I was the first one to ever say it.
Okay, guys, somebody has to say this. Somebody has to rein everybody in, okay, a little bit.
Joseph, being the stoic.
I'm seriously now. I'm not a fan of the federal Liberal Party here or government. I have to tell you, I'm not a fan of what has turned out to be the Doug Ford government here in Ontario and all that stuff. But I think we have to have a sense of proportion here and perspective. And that is to say that Canada is not Belarus, and Justin Trudeau and the Canadian government and the Alberta government are not veering towards the kind of thuggery that we see with the government in Belarus. And
I don't think that's what Chris was saying.
No, but hey,
but it starts with the first step.
But there are people out there that actually think that way, and of course, it's really easy for us to criticize the government here. And I'm not defending any of the actions here that have been problematic, but let's just bear in mind, okay, this is Canada, that's Belarus, or that's Russia, or that's communist China. And as uncomfortable and as concerned as we are about government actions here, particularly surrounding the COVID stuff, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that soon, not in this segment, but in the next segment, or maybe the top of the hour. It's not the same thing. It's not the same thing. We're not living in a country, thank God, yet where we have leaders who are terribly corrupt, who are essentially criminals, who are running for office for no other reason than to further their criminal activity or to continue to enrich themselves criminally, and who are prepared to subvert the security services or the police or the army to further their own criminal ends, including unjust, unreasonable arrests, and throwing people in jail without any kind of cause or argument or justification, torturing people, and in fact going so far as to murder people. I just think somebody has to say it. We have to have some perspective. What we've done to these pastors is wrong. It's too much. It's too far. But when you think about it, you understand that the reasons, as much as I disagree with those reasons, okay, nobody threw any pastors in jail in furtherance of creating a stronger government, okay, or as a corrupt thing. They've done it wrongly because they believe that they have to control these crowds in these settings in order to save everybody from this virus, okay, the coronavirus. And again, totally unjustified in my view, but I could see that there's a qualitative difference between the two actions. So this is why I'm saying is how we got from starting out talking about Belarus to starting to talk about, what's going on with, Justin Trudeau and all that stuff. Well, it's.
I think that both Chris and I can't speak for Chris, but I wasn't trying to say that Canada's becoming as bad as Belarus or Russia, but there are warning signs. And that's what we're talking about with the arrest of these clergy and incarceration, because they didn't bow to the will of the state, which is really what this is all about. They decided that, And I honestly believe there is a place for peaceful civil disobedience.
Right.
Whenever you protest the law, like how many years did they have smoke ups on Parliament Hill where everybody was smoking pot? They didn't throw anybody in jail.
No.
Not that I know of. Certainly not in solitary confinement if they did. So it's the unbalanced approach.
Well, I think that people were really genuinely afraid and continue to be genuinely afraid, whether, again, it's justified or not, of this particular virus.
Well, then don't go to church.
Okay, well, I hear you, okay, but I'm not... Again, I want to emphasize I'm not.
I know you're not on the government side. I know.
Sort of feel like I'm taking an uncomfortable position, but I just see that there is I think an important qualitative difference between the actions on the two sides. That's all. And anyway, that's all. I'm not giving the government a break. I'm just saying that they're not like the Belarusian government.
What concerns me is when you see that image of that pastor being dragged off the highway. That's one of those things that it gets etched in your mind. Like right. Years from now, I'll never forget that image. And what bothers me is the fact that it doesn't shock and bother a lot of people. Like most people, I think, in Canada have seen that picture at least once in the past week. If you see that and it doesn't disturb you, if you see that photo and you say, okay, maybe he was breaking a law, maybe he wasn't respecting the capacity laws of his church, but they could have followed him to his home, escorted him to his home.
Yeah, they could have handled it far differently.
In a different way. But to take a person out on the highway, and by the way, that was, I believe Tucker Carlson on Fox News ran that story with the picture and everything. So when you get a major U.S. network saying, hey, look what's happening in this country above us, it should be embarrassing for the country, but I'm scared that it's not embarrassing enough for the country,
apparently,
or at least
not.
for the city of Calgary.
I will say this, though, that I think Joseph is making a good point. We are not Belarus. We are not Russia. We're not communist China or Pyongyang, North Korea.
Well,
no, I'm just.
Well, I don't know about that.
God. Anyway, the point is we're not there. But what I'm saying is there are warning signs along the road. This is the one you mentioned is one of them. That if we don't become shocked and if we don't demand changes to these kinds of policies that lead to this kind of things, what's the next warning sign going to look like? When do we cross that line? And I would rather stay a long way away from that line than continue down that road that leads to it. Now, I think going back to Belarus, how Ireland is responding to it, I don't know. But I do know that Canada has. And I come back to this idea that our national leader, like when Stephen Harper stood up to Vladimir Putin and he said, what did he say? I'll shake your hand, but you got to get out of Crimea.
Right.
All right, that's typical middle-of-the-road Canadianism. Okay? Yes, I'll shake your hand. I'll be nice. I'll play nice. But you got to get out of Crimea. Okay, the Americans would have said, screw you. You and I are not talking until you do X, Y, Z. Okay, that's the hardcore line, the hardball line. Canada is in the middle between the two. And I respected him for that because he's not provoking more tension, but he's making the Canadian point clear. We do not like the fact that you're in Crimea. And he's letting Putin know in a very balanced way what our government's position is on the topic. Unlike our present leader, and I use that trying to keep the bile down, I'm sorry, I can't help it. Just his politics drive me crazy, if that's what you want to call him. But does he really? Because there's nothing worse than an insincere. It's like the bum's rush, when a bunch of kids get around an alcoholic and they tease him and they bug him until he takes a couple steps after him and they all run off just out of reach, knowing he's going to stop within 3 or 4 and then come back and hound him again. It's called the bum's rush. How do we know that's not what this is?
Yeah. These stories, though, because Belarus was in the news a few months ago because people are not happy with that leader.
Oh yeah, he's faced a lot of protests.
And the protester, like the crackdown on the protesters has been really brutal. I mean, talk about human rights violations. It's terrible. And, they're on the other side of the world, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't care what happens there because...
Well, historically we do.
We do.
Well, and not just historically. We actually have Canadian troops in that region now.
In Latvia,
which is...
well, it's next door.
You have to understand how close these countries are together.
It's next door. I have a friend of mine who's got a son over there.
Who's the behavior of a country like Belarus should be of a major concern to us, quite apart from this particular incident, because what we don't want is to trigger a broader conflict over there, and that's what our troops are there for, along with other NATO troops, is to deter this kind of behavior. Now, granted that the target of their deterrence, if you will, or the subject of their deterrence, is Russia, but it could just as easily be Belarus.
Well, if you go after Russia, you are in fact going after Belarus, because Belarus would not be the way it is without Vladimir Putin's support.
You're probably quite right about that.
Because he's the one supporting this dictator.
Right.
So without his support, he collapses like a house of cards. And and I don't have any problem with Canada being involved on that level. I just don't trust our leadership to be able to put forward the right tone, to be able to have any credibility, I think is even more of a concern in this field, because what stops Putin from turning around and saying, well, you got Bill C-10, how's that any better than what's going on over here? Now, it is, let's face it, I don't think it's passed into law yet, but that's something we can change with the next government. We could always repeal it. We still have the vote. Belarus,
right, and it
doesn't matter much,
and it hasn't passed into law yet either. So it's not, there's still time to change it, and there's still time to, and again, I find that C-10 is, I'm going to avoid using the term draconian, but it's definitely in that direction,
right?
But it's a perfect. I'm just conscious of the time here. But this is a perfect example, actually, of C-10. The motivation behind C-10 is to combat racism and violence, but the incitement to violence, to combat hate, and to promote what are being called today Canadian values and Canada's heritage, which are all wonderful ideas. But if you take a step back to analyze it, you look at it and you go, isn't it ironic that we're prepared to censor free speech and, in a sense, act in the same way as the government of Belarus does? Although I've already said I think there's still a qualitative difference.
I think both Chris and I agree with you.
But we're still able to willing to move in that direction for benevolent reasons. And this is what I always say, is you have to stop looking at the motivation. I don't care whether people want to do it for good reasons or bad reasons. The fact is that once you empower the government to do something for good reasons like this, it's only a very short step to them using the same powers that you've given them for malevolent reasons.
So in other words...
reasons. And so, but people should take a step back and understand and look at a bill like C-10, look at not the intent, but the result, not the motivation behind it, okay?
But
everyone giving themselves a pat on the back for being anti-racist,
right?
For being anti-hate, great, perfect.
So in other words,
what you're doing.
What you're saying is that the wrench in the toolbox doesn't care what nut it turns.
Well, I think that's what I'm saying.
In other words, once you give them a tool, you've given them the tool, and how they use it depends on the guy who's holding it at the time.
Right. And my litmus test is never be a party to giving the government a power that you yourself would not want your opponents to have.
Yeah.
So if I'm a conservative leader, I would be saying we're not supporting this, and the reason we're not supporting it is no government should have this power. Not that, I don't want the Liberals to have this power or that. No government, no conservative government should have this kind of power.